boom and pipeline boom in the same areas as before. And in fact, this pipeline has still not been made, though Justin Trudeau is definitely pushing for it. And in fact, in the 1970s, Elliott Trudeau, his father, was pushing for it. So this has been a family tradition of trying to build this pipeline for about 40 years now. Nevertheless, by 2003, we again also see in the same area as before in the San Juan Basin, a huge push to frack on Navajo lands, and again, a huge pushback now from the Navajo rather than the Ikaria to fight against what they saw as not just the encroachment of a corporation as the potential to poison their lands, but indeed, in fact, the unequal way they were treated through, even when they sold rights for their lands to be fracked, they were paid less than their white counterparts. Shockingly, this is again the El Paso Natural Gas Corporation that's involved. And there was a huge uproar, and in fact, there was something for a little while they were able to postpone fracking there due to the Diné Citizens Against Ruining Our Environment Coalition, which I think is a really great name, in which they noted how an impoverished community such as the Navajo, sitting on such the 7% of all natural gas resources in the US, and yet most Navajos, as the leader mentioned, was still using firewood. In fact, I can quote her as saying, "You can actually smell the gas coming from wells while realizing you can't have gas service for your house in the winter. It's the same as living in a colony." So to kind of skip further ahead, we see by this time period the rapid development, again, of pipeline construction. As we know, the famous fight with the Keystone Pipeline, today with DAPL, all of these emerge, again, from this discourse that started in the early 90s and kind of caught environmentalists off guard by the mid-2000s, particularly the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which exempted fracking and slick water from the Clean Water Act. And suddenly environmentalists, like at least I remember, well, I was never supporting the natural gas thing, frankly, but I remember being like, oh my God, this is terrible. And then by 2008 or 9, you have all these shale plays going on, and it's kind of not too late, but it really snuck up on everyone, if you will, how fast this. So these pipeline fights that are developing now could have really been prevented had they been factored into the environmental externalities of natural gas production. And I will, I suppose, end on that note, except for the fact that we go back to this kind of exterminationist kind of erasure of the environment through natural gas fracking. We see all these earthquakes. We see even the Bakken oil fields causing light pollution at the level of major cities due to gas flaring. And generally, it's a disturbing situation right now. I'll stop. Thank you very much. Yes.
So please welcome Martín Arboleda from Harvard University.
Okay, so good morning to all. My name is Martín Arboleda. I'm going to present today a book project that I'm working on and that I expect to finalize during the next few months. So any feedback, criticism will be much welcome. So I should start by noting how historians of technology have traditionally been puzzled by the ways in which the logics of extraction inform in multiple ways the logics of urbanization. And Gray Brechin, in his landmark work, Imperial San Francisco, reflects on the wealthy, affluent skyline of San Francisco and argues that the skyscrapers are, in philosophical, technological, and economic terms, the inverted minds of the city's vast resource hinterlands, right? So if we take this inversion to our present context, we would ask what sorts of mining, what sorts of geographies of extraction underpin the fantastically alien skylines of Asian megacities, which, as we know, it's like the processes of industrial and urban expansion in East Asian economies are without precedent. I mean, the scale, the velocity, and the intensity of these processes of industrial and urban expansion are without precedent in human history. So I will argue that this present context is premised on the existence of the planetary mine, which is a historically unique geography of extraction that emerges in the context of two epochal shifts. The first of them is the new international division of labor, or the end of the Western phase of capitalism. The early iteration of the new international division of labor thesis was widely popular in the 1980s and fell out of favor in the 1990s because it was established that despite the fact that some parts of large-scale industry had been offshored towards the global south, the hierarchical system structured around in the context of Western industrialized cores and non-Western peripheries had remained intact. However, processes of industrial upgrading and technological modernization taking place after the turn of the century have completely reconfigured the geographies of large-scale industry and the governance composition of global supply chains to such an extent that the discussion is coming back again. And it has led some commentators to argue that we are now living in a Pacific century as opposed to the sort of Atlantic pivot of the capitalist world system. Second, the second of these epochal shifts is the rise of intelligent machines, or the staggering acceleration of automation and the robotization of the production process, right? So the tendency to increase the organic composition of capital, that is the ratio of dead labor to living labor, has always been a tendency in the history of the capitalist mode of production. Since machinofacturing became the underlying technological foundation of large-scale industry. However, after the turn of the century, we appear to be witnessing a new stage in the historical struggle of capital against labor, fueled by this new technological configuration of social production. As you can see in the mining industry, the tendency towards mechanization skyrocketed after 2001, when coincidentally China started to aggressively, and other East Asian economies started to aggressively secure natural resources overseas. Okay, so basically the argument is that this new stage of capitalist production demands understanding the mine not as a self-contained socio-technical object, but as a dispersed network of territorial infrastructures that involves many geographies. So in concert with recent work that has argued for the need to extend the notion of extraction beyond the mere wresting of minerals from the subsurface, and to note its interaction with logistical systems, geographies of labor, networks of financial intermediation, how those many geographies are interwoven within the sociometabolic production and reproduction of the whole of extraction, right? So basically, increasing material separation of manufacturing and extraction as a result of the new international division of labor has pushed the mining industry to achieve a higher degree of functional integration, not only between the various phases of the extraction process, blasting, surveying, haulage, but of the mining industry with other industries, such as the port industry, the shipping industries, smelting, manufacturing, construction, so on and so forth. And so we have to conceptualize the mine as this global infrastructural system, and conceptualizing the mine as a global infrastructural system pushes us to interrogate the dual nature of circulation. So on the one hand, circulation entails the movement of commodities, the physical distribution of commodities through space, right? As you can see here in these dry bulk carriers that are moving around raw materials through the ocean permanently. But also, the concept of circulation also points towards the transition of capital through its diverse phases. This is, like the realization of money as forces of production, the realization of forces of production as commodities, and then when integrated through the distribution system, the realization of commodities again as money plus a surplus profit. So the technological sophistication that mediates this system is staggering, given the huge layers of automation and robotization. How do we make sense of this context? So foreshadowing this movement towards advanced automation and industrial expansion, Moïse Postone's book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, argued that the collective and aggregated species powers of humanity were being seized and inverted into the powers of an alienated system of social domination, one that exists objectively and quasi-independently in algorithms, in human bodies, in technological systems of production, like the bulk carriers that we saw in the previous slide, right? So basically, he argues that because capital displays attributes that were considered uniquely human, such as the urge, the need to valorize itself, to self-expand, and it becomes embodied in objects and humans, it needs to be considered as an entity of an entirely different ontological order than a mere thing or process. For Postone, capital is most adequately grasped as an alienated subject. So in this sense, he reappropriates Hegel's conception of the Geist, but as opposed to Georg Lukács' interpretation of the Geist as the proletariat, this world historical subject that in the act of producing reality, in the act of producing itself, produces reality, Postone argues that it is capital which displays this objectifying world-making practice of the Geist, of spirit. And so, in the process of its own constitution, capital functions through these diverse modes of existence: money, commodities, human laborers. So it is not difficult to see the ways in which, when determined as modes of existence of capital, money, commodities, technological systems have given rise, to paraphrase Marx, to an enchanted and perverted world that appears to be demonically out of joint. And this is clearly grasped in the geographies of the planetary mind. I mean, in Latin America, we see rivers destroyed by cyanide, mercury, explosives, systems of machinery. We see police forces that appear to be bizarrely out of control. Outright extermination of indigenous communities by death squads to make way for extraction projects. Cancer epidemics in mining towns. And these huge robots of extraction that have become more common across the extractive landscape. Right? This also should lead us to pose what are the implications of thinking in terms of modes of existence rather than on structures for understanding the geopolitical underpinnings of extraction. So traditionally, resource booms have been considered in terms of a relation of unequal exchange, dependency between an imperial core and a dependent periphery, usually in the context of an Eurocentric capitalist system. So the present commodity supercycle puts this interpretation into question for two reasons. One, the buyers, the largest buyers of commodity, of raw materials, are now countries traditionally considered as peripheral. And second, this framework of interaction has given rise to a non-hegemonic cooperative framework of international relations. And yet, however, we are witnessing the clearing of peasants from the land and the extermination of indigenous communities to an extent that is without precedent. So I'll argue that idioms of core and periphery, unequal exchange and dependency, which are being brought back systematically to understand these processes of extraction, obfuscate the global content of a process that expresses itself in the form of international politics. This is relevant. This may seem like an obscure, abstract argument, but it is politically relevant for two reasons. One, it reduces the issues of ecological plunder and primitive accumulation associated to extraction to a political problem. This leads to the reformist view that considers that reality can be transformed by the mere seizure of political institutions. This is very clearly crystallized, for example, in the case of the Latin American post-neoliberal governments that frame the context of the dependency of Latin American nations as a political problem, and without making transformations of the social relations that give rise to the political system, and ended up being more dependent on the cyclical nature of the commodity system. Second, It pits the workers of resource-rich countries against those in the manufacturing centers, when in fact, a considerable part of them has come increasingly to share similar conditions of existence. And this is not only in manufacturing centers in Asia, but in the geographies of logistics and distribution in the United States, in Europe. And so, again, the Latin American context is very illustrative, especially, like it leads to the case, for example, when the former vice president of Bolivia, Álvaro García, or the president of Ecuador, points the fingers towards against environmentalists and indigenous communities, saying that, like resisting extraction, saying that they are the useful idiots of empire, because this is a political problem, and let us politicians, fix this. So, like it creates this, like a dichotomy between, like an immaculate us and, like a dependent us, between an evil them, right? Given that, there are there is a deeper underlying content. So the argument is that the planetary mind needs to be understood as the product of the production of relative surplus value at the world scale and the fragmentation of the productive subjectivity of the international working class. This is a process that not only transcends the constitution of the political state, but that is ontologically prior to the constitution of the nation state. So basically, theorists in this, close to Postone's agenda, form analysis, Marxism, open Marxism, have argued that it is not that the world economy is the sum of national economies, but rather the world market, it is a socio-material system that organizes itself in the form of national economies as the mediating political forms. So if we understand the state as a form of existence of an underlying content, we can understand why the encroachment of globalization has evolved alongside the emergence of a more coercive, authoritarian, and interventionist form of late neoliberal statecraft, or authoritarian neoliberalism, as some authors refer to it. Or as Werner Bonefeld puts it, the state is the political form of market liberty. The economy has no existence in itself. It unfolds its existence through the political authority of the nation state. So besides the expanded reproduction of capital, why is it important to insist on the fragmentation of the productive subjectivity of the international working class? As Maria Mies argued early in the preliminary phases of the international division of labor, the universalizing powers of patriarchal capitalism had led to the paradoxical situation where women in the first world and women in the so-called third worlds were simultaneously connected, materially connected, yet subjectively fragmented by commodity production. One of them was exploited in the factory as a producer, the other was enslaved in the household as a consumer, and yet the two of them remained completely oblivious of the other. And so in these geographies of extraction, assembling, summoning into existence this trans-Pacific corridor for the circulation of raw materials has been contingent on the deployment of large-scale territorial infrastructures, highways, railways, large systems of machinery that have displaced many, many peasants in Latin America. But studies of extraction tend to focus as if this was an insular problem. And if we look at what lies at the other side of the spectrum, we will also find a large context of peasant dispossession, displacement, and actually the industrial proletariats of East Asian economies have been harnessed and produced through vast enclosures, vast displacement, that in many ways resembles the context of the peasantries and the indigenous communities in Latin America. I think I'll skip this. And also, this also brings the question of the social determinations of emancipatory consciousness. Because if we think of capital as the alienated subject of the historical movement of modern society, it would appear that this social constitution of capital as alienated subject has given rise to a state of things that seems to deny the history-making practice of humans, the fact that we can transform reality through census practice, right? But according to Postone, it is from these alienated movements, from the reified dynamics of capital, where the foundations for revolutionary subjectivity are to emerge. And we can see how the expansion of these infrastructural systems for resource extraction has also expanded the material capacities of humans who are productive subjects, right? So it's not only, like workers mobilizing against, the mining industry, but also people who coexist with these technological systems, infrastructural systems, who have found in them a means to, encounter, to gain new mobilities. And some of them have led to, it's very common, for example, this woman, Maxima Acuña, took a major mining company to courts and won. And, it's not uncommon to find people, who can, barely read and write, taking to international courts large transnational corporations and winning lawsuits against them. So we can see how, materialist interpretations of technological change show us how the very forces that revolutionize instruments of production can also expand the material powers of the individual as a productive subject, right? Okay, and just to conclude, I want to argue that the concept of the planetary mind, it should be understood first and foremost as a form of defetishizing critique, right? It is important, the task of the left continues to be to show these worlds of alien objectivity, of phantom objectivity, and of how the fact that, the electronic device